So the beginning of this cascade, this sort of interaction between the immune system, the endocrine system, and the nervous system that I had talked about, the intersection between the three of those, and how they respond to stressors in our life, and how yoga can mitigate that. The first thing that we started talking about in this diagram was just an immune challenge. Like you get an infection, you scrape yourself, you have some kind of tissue damage that is going to mobilize a macrophage. And remember, a macrophage are those white blood cells that are like the amoeba that ate Philadelphia or whatever. So we activate this macrophage, and that's going to start an inflammatory cascade. All right? And that inflammatory cascade is going to result in the release of some pro-inflammatory cytokines. Another reminder. Well, you remind me. What is a cytokine?
Ooh, it's literally.
Break the word down. Cell, kind. Yeah. So it's a chemical.
Yeah.
A cytokine is a chemical that makes a cell do something. All right. It's going to cause motion in the cell. In that, it's going to maybe cause some transcription, or it's going to cause some kind of activation, particularly in immune cells, white blood cells. So it's going to start some kind of inflammatory process in the white blood cells. That's where these pro-inflammatory cytokines. If you haven't learned it at this point, when I'm using a word you don't understand, any word like the word lachrymose, dear Lord, what is that word? It means tearful. Yeah, tearful. I use a word you don't understand. You just like put the brakes on and make me or any other person that is around you stop and tell you what that word means. There's no shame in not knowing a word. They didn't know the word at some point in their life either. This is how you learn. Don't be ashamed of seem smart, not smart. So ask me when a chemokine is like a cytokine, but they tend to be smaller chemical molecules. It also gets adhesion molecules going, and anyways, this whole inflammatory process starts ramping up because the macrophage has been activated. So, in particular, we're going to talk about the effects of these three cytokines: tumor necrosis factor, TNF-alpha, interleukin-1, and interleukin-6. We had run across interleukin-6 previously when we were talking about connective. I believe. Anyways, these cytokines cross the blood-brain barrier, and first of all, they're in the blood because the macrophage is releasing these chemicals. Those chemicals, inflammation is basically ramping up the activity of the white blood cells, telling all the white blood cells in the body that something's going on and drawing them to the area of infection, right? This is what a swelling is. The tissue swells, the capillaries dilate so blood can get into the tissue. That's why it feels warm and red and swollen. So the capillaries dilate so the blood can get in there, and there's chemoattractants. So these are chemicals that other white blood cells are attracted to. They move up a gradient of these chemicals so they know exactly where to go. So these chemicals will cross the blood-brain barrier and do some stuff. They also affect sensory nerves in the vagus nerve. So vagal sensory nerves, afferent nerves that are going up into the brain. These nerves are triggered by contact with these cytokines. So there's really two ways that these macrophages are able to affect the brain: directly through the blood-brain barrier, and through a neuronal mechanism through the afferent vagal input. You got me there? Everyone with me? Okay. So once they get in the brain, they're going to stimulate a number of pathways. And I'm going to highlight three of them. Again, this picture was originally, I'm stealing it from a paper about depression. And it's not just about depression for us, but the downstream effects of these cytokines can lead, if it's a chronic condition, can lead to depression. So what are these three pathways? The first of them is simply an altered metabolism of the happy neurotransmitters. That's the way I sort of think of them: serotonin and dopamine. All right, and the dopaminergic receptors, certainly serotonin, we know is related to happiness. Antidepressants are a class of antidepressant is the serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So that is a drug that allows serotonin to exist in the synaptic cleft longer and accentuates the effect of serotonin, elevating mood. So anyways, these pro-inflammatory hormones change the metabolism of serotonin and dopamine and distort the normal signaling that happens with these kinds of neurotransmitters in the brain. The second is the activation of the Hpa axis. And if you throw your mind back a month ago, we talked about the beginning of the Hpa axis by the release of corticotropin-releasing hormone in the hypothalamus, which goes down into the pituitary, turns the pituitary on, and the pituitary releases ACTH, which is an endocrine hormone. It goes through the bloodstream and hits the adrenal gland, which is going to make the various glucocorticoids, which the big one being cortisol that we not cortisone, cortisol. So this is the Hpa axis. That's the second way. So a change in the dopamine and serotonin metabolism, activation of the Hpa axis. And the third is through a broad disruption of synaptic plasticity by alteration in a host of different growth factors. The one I have put up here is brain-derived neurotrophic growth factor. We don't need to know too many of the details about that, but because that little bullet point could be a whole lecture unto itself. But the takeaway is simply that these pro-inflammatory hormones are going to change the ease with which your brain can reconfigure. All right, like the plasticity, the strengthening of certain synapses and the trimming of useless ones. That plasticity of the brain, the ability to learn, essentially, is impaired through these pro-inflammatory hormones. So you can see that so many students are like, "Oh, I got to study for this test. I'm like freaking out," and they're in that zone. But what they're doing is driving this kind of hormonal pathway that's actually reducing their ability to learn. It's reducing the synaptic plasticity that underlies their ability to understand and learn. Yeah, Molly?
So this happens anytime you get infection or tissue damage?
Yeah, I mean, these hormones do get released whenever there's an infection or tissue damage. But it reaches a sort of pathological level when it's chronic. Okay. Yeah. When you're having some sort of chronic pro-inflammatory cascade that's going on in your body.
So it does happen when you skin your, but it's not.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, so you're going to have the production of some of this stuff, right? That's going to get all these different mechanisms moving, but it only becomes really pathologic when it becomes a chronic thing. All right. So let me finish, and it'll become clear. Um, the real problem becomes when it's not just a tissue infection, but there is some sort of other stress that becomes associated with this process. All right. And environmental stressors upregulate that, make these macrophages more sensitive. It sensitizes the macrophages to the this whole process and potentiates the genes that are in the macrophage that are driving. Right? Turns them on. And the way it does that is through sympathetic efflux. So sympathetic nervous system is going to be releasing a bunch of norepinephrine, which these macrophages will be sensitive to. And there's a pathway, there's receptors on the macrophage that are responsive to norepinephrine in the bloodstream that upregulate this and speed this process up, right? So this is a normal process in general, but stress through the sympathetic nervous system drives this harder and makes this cycle spin out of control and leave the homeostatic range, the baseline that it should be in. You guys following that? All right. So this is where we're really going off the tracks. Stress in the brain it has effects on the motor vagal nerve. So this is sensory vagal, this is afferent going up, this is the same nerve, motor vagal coming down. Stress is going to impair this inhibitory output. So the vagus nerve is, you'll remember when I was talking about the ANS, motor vagal nerve is where we get the parasympathetic nervous system coming out. So stress starts turning on sympathetic efflux, the sympathetic chain ganglion, and it turns off the parasympathetic, all right, which is coming out of the vagal nerve. So the sympathetic is potentiating these stress hormones, and the parasympathetic is blocking it. This little bar means it's inhibiting the transcription. This gets turned off by stress. This gets turned on, this gets turned off by stress. And those are reinforcing problems. So again, this is how stress starts sending this normal response to infection off the rails. You guys with me? Okay. And then lastly, these glucocorticoids, the cortisol that's in our blood, goes to a fairly complicated pathway here, which the upshot of it is it releases these genes, the kappa B, the NF-κB genes, which are the pro-inflammatory genes. It releases them from the negative regulation. And essentially, so this is the Hpa axis coming in this other. So on one hand, there's the sympathetic neuronal input, and then there's the endocrine input. These two are kind of doing the same. This is more straightforward. It's a direct effect. This has this complicated activation of an inhibitor of an inhibitor. It's a negative. It's called negative regulation. It's going to have the same effect. Normally, there are brakes that are being put on the NF-kappa B gene. The cortisol takes those brakes off. Does that make sense? All right. So that's the system. That's how stress and infection are all part of driving this immune system, endocrine system, neuronal interplay, right? Well, how does mindful practice help with this? How is it the cure for the common cold, so to speak? All right, well, it does a number of things. First of all, we spent quite a bit of time talking about how we did a lab on how meditation turns off, mindful practice turns off the Hpa axis, reduces the production of cortisol, all right? So it's going to turn off that. We know it also increases parasympathetic output by improving motor vagal tone, all right? So we're turning up the parasympathetic nervous system, which is going to put brakes on NF-kappa B. So turning off Hpa axis and turning on motor vagal, both of them put brakes on the gene transcription for these inflammatory molecules. Okay? Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, awesome. So meditation also turns off sympathetic output, all right? Which reduces the amount of direct activation of these pro-inflammatory genes that we have. And this balance, so restoring this balance would be reflected in things like our heart rate variability as well. Next, it improves the metabolism. It restores the metabolism of serotonin and dopamine, the so-called happiness neurotransmitters that I had talked about. We also spoke quite a bit, spoke at length. I had several lectures about the relationship between meditation and yoga and mindful practice and neuroplasticity. It increases neuroplasticity. It improves levels of brain-derived neurotrophic growth factor, the BDNF. Right? So throwing your mind back, we've covered that, right? We've covered how the brain improves that. And then lastly, yoga, meditation directly mitigates stress. All right? It directly mitigates stress. So it's removing the thing that's driving this whole thing in the first place. Right? And if you're doing meditation, if you're doing yoga, that's actively taking stress out of the equation. So we're not getting as much fuel to drive the process in the first place. All right, any questions on this whole system? All right, so a meta-analysis of various mindful activities in 20 various randomized trials have shown reductions in these pro-inflammatory cytokines. You see an increase in anti-inflammatory cytokines. And all of that together suggests an overall reduction in inflammation. This can be seen as improved immune function. One metric of that is simply people who do yoga and meditation. When they get the flu vaccine, they have a better response to the flu vaccine. They get more immunity from that vaccine when their immune system is working properly because they are not stressed out. All right. So looking at this right here is just a sort of a schematic of the time course of some sort of your immune function. So here we go. We're happy. We're going along. And then there's a stressful event, a 20-page paper on some abstruse topic that you have to be finished with by tomorrow morning. And right, so there's the first phase of that, which is the sympathetic nervous system activation, and that's going to involve so the sympathetic chain ganglia start pumping out all this epinephrine and norepinephrine. Boom. our immune function goes up briefly. All right, briefly it goes up, but then the HPA HPA axis turns on, cortisol gets released quickly as that whole mechanism that I talked about in the last slide turns on, and boom, our immune function begins to go down. And we get out of the acute stress. So there's the 6 hours, that 12 hours, you're riding the high, I can do this. You're writing, I am Superwoman. Type. You've all been there probably, sadly. Yeah, that right? You're just sympathetic nervous system is just, you are invincible, except you're not. You turn the paper in, but you have other things. You're going into this chronic stress zone. And you get, with time, you get an immunosuppression, and inflammation goes up, right? Inflammation goes up. Our immune system is thrown way out of whack because, yes, ma'am?
Well, so then if you just stay in acute stress a lot,
No. That's not how that works. No, that's not how that works. What's up?
So is the tactic of putting things off, and you don't necessarily stress about them until very select moment, and then for 12 hours you're stressed and fun.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a better tactic? Slowly chip away.
Well, you have to. No, it's not, because you have to be able to turn off your HPA axis, right? Because once you get that ball rolling, there's a molecular inertia that starts building up, right? And you have to pay for that eventually, right? And that's what happens after a stressful event. You're you're exhausted. You've been weakened by that. There's this inertia that comes into it. When you are young, you have a large reserve, right? And there's this ability to kind of think that you can push through that. So a lot of students are constantly living up here, but this is training their body in ways that they won't like in the long term. It's also affecting your neuroplasticity. So it's actually decreasing your ability to learn and be productive and be the person that you could be. Right? Yeah. Yeah.
So the more
Absolutely. That certainly is how you got struck. And it's also how I got sick a couple weeks ago when we were doing that cortisol lab, because the waves were crashing on me that week. I had a lot, and I wasn't taking my own advice.
Yeah, that's why whenever I go home Christmas break, I always
Mm-hmm.
and that's because my old school final, coming back from final, being for
Mm-hmm.
4 hours.
That's stressful. Traveling is stressful. Honestly, the best thing you could do after a final is go to bed for a week.
So not final.
Well, I'm just saying. I mean, go home and see your parents. Get there, but just chill out. Often people go home for Christmas and it's friends, party time. Yeah, just relax. Treat yourself right. Rest. Yeah, rest. Okay. So I don't want to talk too much more. That was it. There we go. Look at that graphic I made. I spent so much time on that. Yeah. Well, it's kind of. All right. So we're not going to talk about it now, but I guess we could. No, because I want to get this other stuff done. But I'm going to put this up there for your consideration. I showed you this at the very beginning of the semester so I talked about the history, right? And then I started into the science. And at the beginning, I put this quote up here. Yoga is not a religion. It is a science. Science of well-being, science of youthfulness, science of integrating body, mind, and soul. And I said, is he right? What do you think, right? Is yoga a science? I would like you to, we could spend a couple minutes Does anyone want to share their thoughts? Yeah.
It's both. I mean, like, I don't think it can be both a practice. I definitely think that like there's scientific studies as well be like youthfulness. But I think like also to simply say that it's science and that like there is a spiritual aspect, even if you that is very much so available to
Mm-hmm.
and so I think
Any other thoughts?
both, but it doesn't have to be both. Or some people could just be just be science. It's not one.
So I'll tell you this. I have started the final. I haven't gotten all the way through it. I haven't even gotten just a small portion of the way through it. My typical way I do it is I just go through all the PowerPoints and I make a ton of questions up. And then after I have way more questions than I'm planning to ask, I go through and pick out the best of them. And that becomes the final. Thinking about whatever essay that I might write, I haven't written it yet, but I'm going to ask you a question on this topic here. I'm going to ask you a question on this topic and get you to be a little bit discursive. Something to think about. Yeah.
when you mean that, do you mean you examples like scientific directly from it, or
Well, if I was thinking about this, how to answer this question, yeah, okay, I'm sorry. So it is a science of well-being. Okay, all right, that's fine. The first thing this question begs is a definition of science. What is science, right? And that's kind of the point of this class. This is getting you to like satisfy your science requirement, right? And so I want you to understand what science is. So any way that you would like fully successfully address this question would be part of that would be coming to an account of what science is in the first place, right? So any other thoughts? I want you guys to have time to talk to each other and then ask any kind of review questions that you want. Yeah? No? You're good? What's up? Yeah, think about it. Right. This is not like the answer is 43.26 grams per liter squared. There's going to be a range, like, I want an answer that is well reasoned and is compelling, and there could be 2 different, 3 different, 12 different answers to that question, right? But I want to see that you're thinking deeply and have some understanding of science and yoga. All right, moving on. Why don't you guys? I'm done. Oh.
yeah.
Why don't you guys